Thanks. I'm Sandra Peart, Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and on behalf of our faculty, students, and staff, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the third event in our Jepson Leadership Forum series this year entitled The Fix: Health, Science, and the Future. The response we received for this evening's event from the University of Richmond and the greater Richmond communities was so large that we decided to change the venue, and I want to welcome you to the chapel this evening. The Cannon Memorial Chapel became the home for this evening at rather the last moment, and I want to thank Shannon Best of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, as well as our colleagues in the chaplaincy, telecommunications, and events management for making these rearrangements at rather a last-minute date. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors for this evening's event, the Department of Philosophy and Style Weekly. We're live streaming this event, and I want to welcome those of you who are watching the event as we do so. I want to especially welcome our Jepson alumni, and especially those in Washington, D.C. who recently took part in an alumni discussion related to the topic of the fix. I want to welcome those in Randolph-Macon College, the Department of Philosophy, faculty, and students who have gathered on their campus in order to watch the live stream. So welcome to all of you. One of the greatest joys associated with being the Dean of the Jepson School is getting to know our talented students, and it's now my pleasure to introduce one of them to you, Win Han, who will introduce our speaker this evening. Win is a University of Richmond senior who is double majoring in leadership studies and cognitive science. He's originally from Maine, and he serves as a writing consultant at the University of Richmond and a member of the Honor Council. This semester, he's doing his Jepson internship at the office of Senator Tim Kaine, former leader in residence at the Jepson School. Please welcome Win Han to the stage.
Good evening, and thank you, Dean Peart. As a senior here at the University of Richmond, I've had the opportunity to study ethics in a variety of settings. Without a philosophical understanding of ethics, it may be tempting to reduce the subject to a peripheral set of rules invoked by religion, law, or professional standards. The study of ethics encompasses these types of guidelines, but its scope is much larger. Fundamentally, ethics accounts for the normative value of our decisions, the reasons for choosing to do what's right at the expense of our other options. I have grown fond of the subject because, in the words of my current ethics professor, Dr. Jess Flanagan, it raises the price of our beliefs. It requires critical self-examination, and it challenges us to justify and live by our principles. I am deeply honored to introduce our speaker tonight because of his enormous contribution to the study of ethics and philosophy at large. Dr. Peter Singer has been called the world's most influential living philosopher. His 1972 essay, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, argues that we have a responsibility to reduce the suffering of others when the cost is morally insignificant to ourselves, as is often the case. This piece has become a staple in ethics curricula around the world. His 1975 book, Animal Liberation, is the preeminent defense of the moral status of animals and has radically challenged our treatment of other species. In 2009, he published The Life You Can Save, continuing to assert our ethical obligation to give. Dr. Singer is from Melbourne, Australia, and currently serves as the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics in the University Center for Human Values at Princeton University, a position that he combines with the title of Laureate Professor at the University of Melbourne. In 2014, the Gottlieb Duttweiler Institute ranked him third on its list of global thought leaders, and Time magazine has included him among the world's 100 most influential people. In 2012, he was made a companion to the Order of Australia, his country's highest civilian honor. Dr. Singer's recent work, The Most Good You Can Do, discusses the effective altruism movement and details how each of us can reduce suffering, improve well-being, and do the most good for the world. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Singer.
Thank you very much, Wynne, for that introduction. Thank you all for coming here. And of course, thank all of those from the Jepson School who've been involved in making this visit possible and organizing it. I am going to talk to you, as Wynne said, about effective altruism, about the most good you can do. I see some people still standing at the doorway, by the way. I think you'll find seats if people can make space there. So, let's see. So, this is what we're talking about. And perhaps the first thing that you're going to ask is, what is effective altruism? What does that term actually mean? Well, it refers both to a philosophy and to an emerging movement. A philosophy not in the formal sense like Kantianism or utilitarianism, but a philosophy in the broader sense of a way of living, an approach to living. That is, in part, as the word altruism suggests, the idea that we ought to live not only thinking of ourselves, but thinking of others and thinking of making the world a better place. That ought to be a significant part of our lives. I won't put it more precisely than that. It certainly doesn't require or expect that we're all going to be saints, but it does suggest that living to make the world a better place should be one of your prime aims in life. But it's not only that. The idea of adding effective in front of altruism is to say, it's not enough just to think, here's some good cause and so I'll give to it either financially or in terms of my time, volunteer my time and skills. Because it may be that there are better things that you could do with your time and skills. And if there are better things you could do, then why not do them? That's the idea of the most good you can do. Why not do the most good you can do rather than just do some good? But to work out what is going to be the most good you can do, you need not just a warm heart, but you need to use your head. You need to use your capacity to reason, to look at evidence, to analyze that evidence, and to work out where you can do the most good. So that's really what effective altruism is about. It's about trying to make the world a better place, but to think about how to do that, to make the biggest possible impact that you can. Now, it's also, as I said, an emerging movement. And this is something quite recent. So it's within the last 10 years, I'd say it's from around 2007, that we started to get groups of people coming together to talk about how to be effective altruists, how to think in this way. And the very term effective altruism is from, I think, actually around 2009 when the term was coined and came into general use. So as you'll see as I go through things I'm going to talk about, this is something that's new in a variety of ways, but it's now something where we have effective altruism chapters around the world in a lot of different countries, on a lot of campuses, not only on campuses, also in a number of cities, where people are talking and discussing this, and there's a large online community talking about how best to be effective as an altruist. So that makes it an exciting time, I believe, to talk about this topic. And because the potential is there, we don't really quite know where the movement can grow or develop, but there are very promising signs out there that it's already having a significant impact. I've used this term, make the world a better place. You might say, what exactly does that mean? Clearly, there are values at stake here, and as a philosopher working in ethics, I'm interested in values. So what are the values that are characteristic of the effective altruist movement? The first thing that comes up here is already expressed in the idea, make the world a better place. Effective altruists are universalists as far as their values are concerned. They are not focused only on making their community a better place, or even their nation a better place. They are focused on making the world a better place. Perhaps, for some people in some circumstances, making your community a better place is the best contribution you can make to making the world a better place. But that's certainly not necessarily so. And that's not an assumption that effective altruists would make. They would want to look at the evidence of where you can make the biggest difference in order to reach that decision. Secondly, in saying what would make the world better, effective altruists tend to be fairly down to earth and concrete in the values that they will at least come to first. Maybe not the only values that they'll endorse, but the foremost values would be things like reducing the amount of suffering that there is in the world. It seems obvious that if there's less suffering, then to that extent the world is a better place. If other things are equal, everything else you hold constant, but there's less suffering in the world is a better place. And similarly, if people enjoy their lives more, if they're happier, more satisfied with their lives, the world is a better place. Another thing that is pretty obvious is that if there are fewer people dying prematurely, the world is a better place. When children die from avoidable, preventable causes, that's a bad thing. And if we can reduce those deaths, we've made the world a better place. So those are the primary values, I'd say, that effective altruists talk about. And one other thing I'll add, when they talk about suffering, they would acknowledge that it's not only human beings who suffer, and it's not only human beings whose suffering matters. So as Wynne said in introducing me, 40 years ago I published a book called Animal Liberation, and I've been interested in reducing the suffering of animals ever since, or indeed a couple of years before I started writing that book. Effective altruists would agree that reducing the suffering of animals is a good thing to do. They might not agree with me entirely on how much emphasis to place there. Some of them might say they think humans can suffer more or in more significant ways, and so we should focus on reducing the suffering of humans rather than the suffering of animals. Some of them, and I would be one of them, would say, I think we ought to do both, and sometimes actually what's going to reduce the suffering of animals will reduce the suffering of humans as well in various ways. But it is talking about suffering generally, not only for human beings. Another aspect of the thought of effective altruists is that they want to make a difference in the long term. We often hear talk about sustainable goals. So effective altruists would be impartial between reducing suffering now and reducing suffering at some time in future, if we put aside the fact that the further we get into the future, the less certain we can be about the effect of our actions. So that's clearly relevant. But no discounting of the future merely because it's not the present or the near future. The future matters. And that's why effective altruists are concerned that their efforts to make a difference will last, will be sustainable, and they'll work on causes that make a difference. When they do think about uncertainty, they will consider the expected value of any proposal or plan or strategy to reduce suffering or save lives. By expected value, they mean the value discounted by the odds against it being achieved. So essentially, if you have a choice between saving 1 life with certainty or a 50% chance of saving 10 lives, you would say 10 lives, a 50% chance, that means you divide 10 in half to get the expected value of a 50% chance of saving 10 lives. It's equivalent to saving 5 lives with certainty. So you'd prefer to choose the strategy that would save 10 lives with a 50% chance than the strategy that would save 1 life with certainty. And if you pursue that strategy time and time again, of course, even though in the first time you might actually save no lives, in the long run, you are going to save more lives. So that gives you a sense, I believe, of the kind of values that effective altruists hold and how they want to go about actually promoting those values. Now let me just say a little bit about some of the people in this movement, which will give you a sense of the thinking behind it and also a little bit about how it got going. So first, I did want to show you this slide, which is going to be familiar to many of you. It went around the internet a lot. It's the Syrian child, Ayaan Kurdi, who was found dead when his family was trying to get to Greece. And of course, this was a tragedy that moved a lot of people. One of the things that effective altruists will point out is that there are children dying every day, not just one of them, from avoidable, preventable diseases. Many of them, in fact. Although, fortunately, we've been making good progress over the last couple of decades in reducing the number of children who die from preventable poverty-related causes. And just the last figures that UNICEF published that came out in September showed that that number has now gone below 6 million per year. When I published the book that Wynne mentioned, The Life You Can Save, in 2009, that figure was 9.7 million. So that's very substantial progress in just 6 or 7 years. But 6 million is still something like 16,000 children dying every day. So when we look at this picture and think how terrible, we should not think, oh, it's terrible, but I'm powerless to do anything about this Syrian crisis. The Syrian crisis is very difficult and very complex, but in fact, there are children dying from much less complex causes where it's much easier to reduce deaths. So you can contribute to, for example, the Against Malaria Foundation, which is an organization that is effectively reducing the deaths of children by distributing bed nets in areas where malaria is a major killer of children. And so I think when people think about something like this, you should think, I'm not powerless, I can be effective, I can make a difference. But I was going to go and talk to you a little bit about how this movement got started. Here's one of the people who was influential in getting it going. Toby Ord, back in 2007, was a graduate student in philosophy at the University of Oxford. As a graduate student, he was living on a studentship which was paying him £14,000 a year. Oxford is not a particularly cheap city to live in. That's not a lot of money, most people would think, to live. But Toby felt that it was perfectly adequate for him. He was meeting not only his basic needs, he still had enough to do things like travel across to France during the summer vacation and do some sightseeing there. And he thought to himself, I'm hoping to have an academic career after I graduate. And as an academic career, I will get paid more than my studentship. In fact, if I'm successful, I'll get various promotions and better positions, and I'll end up getting paid quite a lot more than my studentship. But I don't really need that money. I'm quite happy on my studentship. What could I do if, instead of just increasing my consumer spending as I get more money, I continued to live as I'm living now and put aside the extra money to do something more worthwhile. So he did the calculations. He worked out what a typical academic might earn throughout his or her career, deducted from that the amount that he would need to continue living more or less as he was, and ended up, of course, with a quite substantial sum of money. He then looked around for what are inexpensive things you can do in the world that will do a lot of good. And the one that he hit upon was this one. Trachoma is the largest preventable cause of blindness in the world today. It's a microorganism that can get into your eyes. It's prevalent in dusty, dry places where hygiene is not particularly good. At first, you hardly notice it, and it becomes slightly irritating. Then as the years go by, and even as the decades go by, your vision slowly gets blurred. And so, these children may already have trachoma but not really be noticing it, but by the time they're 40, if it's not treated, they're likely to be blind, and they'll be blind for the rest of their lives. But there is a treatment, there is a preventive treatment, and it's very inexpensive. Toby looked at some studies as to what it costs, not per treatment, but per case of blindness prevented. And he came up with a figure of about $25 per case of blindness prevented. And when he divided that figure into the amount of money that he'd calculated he would have in excess of meeting his needs and having some to spend for enjoyable purposes, he came out with a figure that he alone could save the sight of 80,000 people. And he thought, isn't that amazing? I alone could prevent a huge football stadium full of people from going blind. And I wouldn't even have to be fantastically rich or anything, or a brilliant scientist who discovers a cure for a disease. Just, going through with my normal career, I could do something like that. So, having reached that conclusion, he thought, everybody ought to know about this. Surely if more people know about this, I won't be the only one who wants to do this. So he set up an organization called Giving What We Can and a website to tell people about this. And he himself took a pledge that he would live on the inflation-adjusted equivalent of £18,000 a year. He decided to allow himself a little more slack over his studentship, and he would pledge to give the rest of it away to effective charities. And that got him quite a lot of publicity, got into particularly British media, and quite a lot of other people started supporting Giving What We Can. The website doesn't ask people to make as demanding a pledge as that. It asks people to pledge to give 10% of their income to effective charities. Not such a difficult thing to do, and there are now quite a large number of people who've pledged, and the amount of money that predictably they will give if they go through their careers is now in the hundreds of millions of pounds. So Toby has made a very significant difference in the world through setting up that organization. And the organization also makes suggestions about which are effective charities. So there's one person who's been really influential. Okay. Here's somebody else who didn't come to this through philosophy. Julia Wise is a woman who lives in the Boston area. And even as a child, once she learnt that there were people in the world who were hungry, she realized that she was very fortunate because she never had to go hungry. In fact, her family provided her with really everything that she wanted. But sometimes she thought when her family provided her with something that she wanted, but certainly didn't need, that maybe they shouldn't. Maybe that was depriving someone else who was hungry of being able to go to bed not feeling hungry at night. And she decided that when she had some money, she was going to do something about that. So she went to college. She wanted to become a social worker. She met somebody else there, fell in love with him, and told him about her life plan. And although he hadn't had such thoughts as a child, obviously either he was open to the reasoning that she used, or love was a powerful persuasion. I don't know. But he agreed to share a substantial part of what they had with others. And so even when they didn't have very much money, when she was working as a social worker, he was training as a computer programmer but wasn't earning much, they already started giving a third of what they earned to charities. And I suggest you read Julia's blog, Giving Gladly. It's a very personal account of why she did this, why she's doing it, how she lives, and why she finds it a fulfilling way to live, and something she's really glad to be having the opportunity to do. Jeff has now, her husband has now completed his training, and fortunately, not only for him, but indeed for everybody, he landed a good-paying position at Google in Boston. So they're now giving half of their income to charity because they have really more than they need. And just to show that this is not only a first world kind of idea, I wanted to show you Celso Viera, who is Brazilian, lives in Belo Horizonte in Brazil, has very modest means. He told me in an email that when he moved house, he was able to pack up all of his possessions into a backpack and a single suitcase. But nevertheless, despite that, he's giving 10% of his income to charities. He's also set up a branch of Giving What We Can in Brazil. So those are three people in this area. I want to now switch to the topic of what is an ethical choice of career, because when I address people at a university, of course, many of you will not yet have decided your career. That's still an open choice. And this is a really important decision to make. There's another person whose photo I haven't shown you, who's significant in effective altruism, called Will McCaskill. Will thought that there ought to be more thought about the ethics of career choice. And Will did his own calculation, and purely by coincidence, came up with the same figure of 80,000. But in Will's case, his calculation was, how many hours does a person typically spend in their career? And 80,000 is his approximate answer to that. So if you're going to spend 80,000 hours in your career, how many hours is it worth spending thinking about what career you're going to go into? Suppose you say, well, maybe at least 1% of that 80,000 hours, right? Okay. But 1% of 80,000 is 800. That's quite a lot of time thinking. I think very few people actually spend 800 hours thinking about their career choice. But it's definitely worth thinking about. And Will, of course, as an effective altruist, was interested in getting people to consider not just a career that they'll enjoy, although obviously that's going to be something for everybody, a career that they'll find fulfilling or worthwhile, but also take into account how can you make a positive difference to the world through your career. And he checked around online, what kind of advice is around for people who say, I want to have an ethical career. And there is some advice around, but it was fairly obvious, Will thought. So you can go and find a good NGO and work for that. Or you can, if you can get in, go to medical school and become a doctor and go and work in a developing country where there are poor standards of health care. That kind of advice. And Will thought, well, that's true. Those are good things to do. But there are other things that you could do that could also be good that people may not think of. And because of the way Will was talking about this and putting up some information online, he put up this website, which is called, I don't know if you can see it up there, it's called 80,000 Hours, so 80,000hours.org, if you want to have a look for it. Put out some different suggestions about evidence-based advice on careers to start this ethical career discussion. One of my students took a look at that, got in contact with Will, got in contact with some other people, part of an effective altruism group. This is not always working. Okay, here he is. He's called Matt Wagah. He was a very good Princeton philosophy undergraduate. He got the department's prize for the best senior thesis in his senior year. He was offered a place at Oxford University to do graduate work in philosophy and at other good graduate programs. But after thinking about what career would make the best possible difference to the world, he didn't accept the place at Oxford. He went to talk to the recruiters who come to Princeton from New York City and seek to recruit people for jobs in the finance industry on Wall Street. And he took a job there. Now you might say, how is that an ethical career choice? But the thinking that I guess Will had put out there as one possibility, not necessarily something that's going to suit everybody, the thing is, one possibility is if you can do good by donating money, as Toby Ord had already calculated, then you can do more good by earning more money. Now, clearly jobs on Wall Street can be well-paying, and Matt did get a very high-paying job. In fact, within 1 year of graduating from Princeton, he was able to donate $100,000 to effective charities. Obviously, he also, like Toby, didn't really change his lifestyle that much from his student days, had to resist the corrupting influences of some of the people he was working alongside, who no doubt were living a much more lavish lifestyle, and therefore had a lot of money to donate. He's now about 4 years out from graduation, and he's continued to donate at least that figure, at least a six-figure sum each year. You might still ask, well, obviously he's a talented guy that he was getting paid that much, he could get that job. Couldn't he have done as much good by getting a job with an NGO? It's possible that he could have, but one reason for thinking that he might be doing more good this way goes like this. Suppose that he'd seen a job advertised at an NGO that he thinks is generally good. Let's say it's Oxfam, just for example. And suppose he'd applied for that job and he'd been successful. And then he'd worked in that job for some years and he'd done lots of good things in that job. Could he say, if I hadn't taken this job, none of these good things would have happened? Well, no, he couldn't really say that, could he? Because after all, he wouldn't have been the only applicant for that job. There are probably lots of reasonably talented people who want to work for Oxfam. And if he hadn't applied for the job, the second best applicant of the field would have got the job. And the second best applicant in the field probably would have been almost as good as he was, and would not perhaps have achieved everything that he achieved, but would have achieved quite a lot of it, maybe 90% of it, who knows. So he could only say, I can really only take credit for the extra 10%, that because I'm more talented than the second best applicant, I achieved. Now, consider what he could do with $100,000 that he's got to donate. Let's just assume again that he were to give it all to Oxfam. Oxfam could create a completely new position. In fact, since it doesn't pay its workers $100,000 typically, it could probably create a new position and still have some left over to do other things. But then Matt could say, whatever the person in the new position does, that's really something I can take credit for, because that position would not have existed at all. So I can there say 100% of the good that that person does is due to the fact that I decided to go to Wall Street, earn money, and give it to Oxfam. And if I hadn't done that, none of that would have happened. So that's one reason for thinking this may be a good thing to do if, as I say, you have the character to resist corruption, if you also have the ability to do that kind of work, and I'd have to say, you have to have a certain liking for the kind of work. And Matt actually does find the work pretty intellectually challenging. It appeals more to his kind of mathematical side than his philosophy side to some extent, but he's creating algorithms for a company that is trying to work out which commodities will rise or fall in price and take long or short positions in those commodities accordingly. So that's another contribution that effective altruism has made to that debate, and Matt's not the only one. There are a reasonable number of people who are earning to give, some more successfully than others, some try it for a year or two and then decide to do something different, they don't like it, some of them persist in it for indefinitely. Okay, I want now to talk briefly about what cause should an effective altruist choose. I've been talking about global poverty, but of course philanthropy is much broader than that. And you might say, is that the best way to make a positive difference in the world? Now, one of the things that effective altruism is trying to do is actually to get the whole of the philanthropy sector to think more about this issue. Because philanthropy is a huge thing in the United States. $350 billion are donated to charities each year in this country. That's about 2% of GDP. Unfortunately, a lot of it is done with zero research at all. Surveys of individuals who donate to charities, who ask them, did you do any research before donating, find that 70% acknowledge that they did zero research. And the other 30% do very little research on it either. I'll come back to that in a moment. And some people think that, in fact, as long as you're giving to a charity, it doesn't really matter what you do, and there isn't perhaps even really a way of deciding what is the best thing to do. This is Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, one of the biggest philanthropy advisors in the country. It's advised billions of dollars going into philanthropy. It has a website which says giving away money is simple, giving away money effectively is an entirely different matter. Every effective altruist would agree with that statement, but they wouldn't agree with this statement, which you find also on the website in one of the little guides called Finding Your Focus in Philanthropy, that says not only that there's no objective answer to what's the most urgent issue, but there's obviously no objective answer. I doubt that many philosophers would really think that that was obvious, even if some of them might think that in the end it's true. I happen to be a philosopher who thinks that it's neither obvious nor true. At least I would agree that it's very difficult sometimes to pick between some of the possible causes that might be sort of good competitors in that range of really good causes. But there's some causes that I think you can pretty clearly, objectively say are not as good as others. Here's a big donation that was given earlier this year where I think you can easily say there were objectively better things for David Geffen to do with his money. David Geffen, if you don't know, is a billionaire entertainment mogul. You've seen the DreamWorks logo when you've been to the movies. That's one of his ventures. So he recently gave, as you see, $100 million to the Lincoln Center for the renovation of its major concert hall. Perhaps some of you have been there and have attended a concert at Avery Fisher Hall. Well, you've attended your last concert at Avery Fisher Hall, I'm sorry to say. Next time it'll be David Geffen Hall. I just think that it's pretty staggering to say that there is no objective way of choosing between improving the concert experiences of wealthy New Yorkers or tourists who go to New York and, for example, preventing, well, if Toby's figures was right, preventing 4 million people from becoming blind. or preventing, let's say, hundreds of thousands of children from dying of malaria, depending a little on how you cost that. But hundreds of thousands, I think, would be a reasonable thing to say. I think in the world in which we live, I'm not against concerts. I'm not against people having great experiences when they go to concerts. I'm not even against them having fine concert halls in an ideal world. But we are not living in an ideal world. We're living in a world in which there are, fortunately now the latest figures show not quite a billion. I used to say a billion people living in extreme poverty. Again, we've made some progress. The last figures show the number has dropped below a billion, which is good. But there are still hundreds of millions, maybe I think it was around 800 million people living in extreme poverty. There are, as I said, 16,000 children dying every day from preventable diseases. There are also something like 60 billion animals that are killed each year for food, and the great majority of them live horrible lives in factory farms. That's another thing that I think you could properly donate to try to reduce. You could very properly be troubled by climate change and donate to try to find ways of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and therefore preventing the likely catastrophic effects that continuing down the path we're on now will have on the climate of our planet in decades and centuries to come. All of those things, I think, would clearly be objectively better things to do than this kind of donation. So I think that's the kind of thing that we want to be focusing on. Now, I said I would say a little bit about effectiveness once we've chosen a cause, whether it's one of those causes I just mentioned. How do we decide which is a good charity to donate to? I said that most people do no research at all. Until the development of the effective altruist movement within the last decade, it wasn't really easy to find out which charities were the most effective. The best you could do was to go to a website called Charity Navigator. And the 30% of people who did some research, most of them went there, or one or two other organizations give similar information, and they looked up the percentage of general revenue that a charity allocates to administration and fundraising rather than to programs. And they used that as a basis for saying the less that goes to administration and fundraising, the more that goes to programs, the better the charity is. So I'll select the charity on that basis. Now, is that useful information? At the extreme, it is useful information. If you go to Charity Navigator and you see that a charity that has asked you for a donation is spending, let's say, 80% of its revenue on administration and fundraising, don't give to it. It's basically a fraud. Even if it's 60%, you might say, don't give to it. But if you get down to say, well, here's one charity, and incidentally, you know, the charities that you would think of, that you would come to at the top of your head, the Oxfams, the Save the Children, the CARE, the World Vision, or the Better Animal Charities, the Humane Society of the United States, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. You know, most of the charities, whatever cause you're interested in, educational charities, they're not going to be spending 80 or 60% on administration. They're maybe going to be spending 25%, and some of the others you might be spending perhaps only 10%. Now suppose you've got those figures. Does that tell you that the charity that spends only 10% is really better than the charity that spends 25%? Think about it this way. What is the extra 15% of general revenue actually doing? Is it, for instance, paying for skilled staff to select the programs that the charity will spend on? Is it paying for skilled staff to monitor and evaluate those programs so that the charity will not continue to spend money on programs that are not achieving the goals that they are intended to achieve? If so, then the charity that spends 25% on administration might actually be doing a much better job than the charity that spends only 10%. Think of it this way. With a charity that spends 10%, 90% goes to programs. But with few administrative staff, perhaps half those programs are failing to achieve what's wanted, and the charity doesn't even know about it. So only 45%, only 45 cents in every dollar you donate to that charity is actually doing good. The other charity, 75% is going to its programs, but because of the monitoring of it, only, let's say, 10% of the programs are failing. So of that 75%, all but 7.5%, 67.5 cents in every dollar is actually doing good, doing what's intended to. That's a lot better than 45 cents in every dollar. So it's not very useful information just to get those figures within that kind of range. But as I say, that was really all that was available until these guys came along. Holden Karnofsky and Ellie Hassenfeld, again around the same period of time, around 2007. They were working for a very successful hedge fund. And they, together with another half dozen of their friends at work, were making much more money than they'd expected to be making. They were still in their 20s. They had more than they needed. They were not the sort of, lavish party types. They hadn't developed a coke habit or anything like that. So they said to each other, we could give some of this away. And then they all said, okay, so where will we give it? And somebody said, give it to this charity. Somebody said, give it to that charity. They all said, well, how do we know what these charities would do with our money? They said, let's write to them. Each of us write to our favorite initial sort of choice of a charity, and we'll ask them, suppose that we were to give you a substantial donation. What would you do with it? What difference would it make? So they wrote to the charities. But when the answers came back, they found that they still hadn't got the information they wanted. Remember, these are hedge fund guys. They're nerds. They're spending all day analysing spreadsheets and with their heads full of data to decide where their hedge fund should invest. And now they're getting back glossy brochures with pictures of smiling kids and anecdotes about how this charity changed my life. But that's not real data. They want to know, how often does this happen? So they went round again. They called the charities and said, look, you sent us this, but it's not what we wanted. Can we have this kind of data? And still they didn't get it. Some of the charities said, we don't have that information. One of the charities said, that information is confidential. One of the charities accused them of being a spy for some rival organisation. And eventually, Holden and Ellie just said, there's a vacuum here. If we can't get this information, nobody can get it. And that's a really bad thing, because nobody is able to donate to the most effective charities. So they asked their friends at work to give them some seed money to set up a new organisation. And they set up this organisation called GiveWell, which exists precisely in order to do proper research on organisations to find out which ones can demonstrate that they're really effective. And this is their website. As you see from this is supposed to be a circle, but the slides are getting a little bit distorted here. So you see from this pie chart, they reviewed hundreds of charities, and they're only recommending quite a small number. Now, I don't want you to get the idea from that most charities are useless. That's not what the pie chart shows. What the pie chart shows is that most charities cannot demonstrate their effectiveness to the standards that GiveWell requires. Now, as one of our defence chiefs said a few years back, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but in this context, that was not actually really good. In that case, turned out not well. But in this case, it may well be that many of these charities are effective, but just can't really demonstrate it rigorously enough. But what that means is that if you do want to donate to a charity, that you really can be confident is highly effective, go to GiveWell.org and donate to one of their top charities, because it will have been very thoroughly vetted for being a highly effective charity. And that's important information. If you're interested in giving to animal charities, then there is a much newer organization, unfortunately not nearly as well funded as yet, called Animal Charity Evaluators. Go to animalcharityevaluators.org. They've also got some recommendations for what they judge to be the most effective animal welfare charities. So this is important information that makes it possible for us, I think, to give with much greater confidence that we are actually doing good. Now, and here's an organization that spun off the book that, as Wynne mentioned, I published The Life You Can Save, that set up a website to give people more information. Then that various people offered to help to turn that into an organization, and that's now an organization which also has this tab up the top there, where to donate, also recommends some organizations. So I want to make sure that we have some time for questions, and I'm going to leave it at that point. I hope I've said enough to give you plenty to think about how you can be more effective in your life and how you can actually find it a fulfilling and a rewarding thing to do to become an effective altruist. Thank you. Oh, I've been told to say that for questions, we have a microphone here. We are being live streamed, so we want everybody, both in the room and out of the room, to be able to hear the questions. So please, if you have a question, if you'd walk down that aisle on the side there and come down and line up at the microphone, you can ask your question there. Well, this is your opportunity. I'm sure a line is going to develop. So if you get there early, you won't have to wait in line. Good. We have someone.
Hi, Dr. Singer. So,
please keep close to the mic so you can be heard well.
From your perspective, if the goal is to do the most good and to reduce suffering, does it matter if the money is the outcome of actions that cause suffering in the first place to produce the income?
Well, certainly it matters if the money is the outcome of suffering, because suffering is a bad thing. And if you could have not caused that suffering by not earning the money, then definitely that matters. Are you thinking of Matt Wagah, who went to Wall Street, as causing suffering, or are you just asking the question in general?
No, in general, I think that it's sort of worth considering if the suffering from a particular industry, maybe the production of certain kinds of, like food or tobacco, right, alcohol, something like that, if the suffering caused by that was actually,
right,
yeah. I think you know what I'm trying to say.
So I know, yes. So there's an interesting question, and I think some effective altruists may take one view and some may take a different view. One of the questions, because effective altruists tend to be oriented towards outcomes and consequences, one of the questions that they might ask is, would this suffering have been caused if I had not taken this job? So let's suppose, I've talked to Matt about this, and Matt thinks that the kind of work that he does, as I said, it's a commodity arbitrage firm. He thinks that that is pretty neutral in terms of its outcome. If anything, maybe he thinks it's slightly positive because it tends to smooth out the changes in commodity prices rather than make them sudden jumps. But let's assume, some people, I think, working in finance, maybe they're raising finance for opening a new coal mine, right? And I think because of coal's contribution to climate change, that would be a bad thing to do. So some effective altruists would nevertheless say, suppose that I were to quit this job or not take this job because of that, would that make a difference, or would there somebody else just take the job with less of a conscience than I have and be just as effective at raising finance for the new coal mine? So some effective altruists would say, if that's the case, then I might as well take the job because I'm at least going to give a large part of my earnings to charity, whereas the other guy is probably not going to do that. Other people would say, no, I don't want to be complicit in causing this harm. And that's a notion of complicity that deontologists, typically non-consequentialists, maybe Kantians, would want to hold and say you should not be involved. So that's a debate that I think you'd get different views in effective altruism.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Dr. Singer, I just want to thank you for coming and giving your presentation. My question concerns the notion of universal regard for others. There's a critique to that claim that empathy is a chemical process in the brain that's created through oxytocin in the limbic system, and that is a limited source. So some people claim that if we tried to show equal regard for every sentient being on Earth, we would just completely drain ourselves dry. So they think we should instead focus on those close to ourselves in our tribe, to say. So I was wondering what your response to that was.
Okay, I have two different responses to that. One is, I don't think that the effective altruist movement relies exclusively on the kind of empathy that you're talking about. Some people in it, I'm sure, do, but there's quite a few people in the movement who you'd have to say more moved by their rational understanding of what other people are suffering than the idea that they have strong emotional bond or empathy with them. In other words, there's a range of people in the movement. I think they vary. I think some of them more empathetic than others, some of the examples that I've given. But some people may just see this as a good thing to do without straining their empathy and without therefore diminishing the feelings that they do have for other people who are close to them. So I think that's a part of it. The second thing that I want to just mention here is a really interesting book that came out just in September that some of you will have read reviews of. It's called Strangers Drowning. It's by Larissa McFarquhar, who's a New Yorker writer. And in it, she describes in quite a lot of detail a number of people who are living according to a very demanding morality. Basically, they are caring about strangers in different ways. It includes Julia Wise, who I showed here. One of the people she writes about, but it includes a lot of other people who maybe are not exactly in the effective altruist sort of stream. But what that shows is that there are people who are quite remarkable in the extent to which they can care for others and care for strangers and do an immense amount of good in the world.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for coming to talk to us, Dr. Singer. That was really great. My question is, if you always want to donate where it's most effective, and you're thinking universally, you'll always think of the treatment for malaria or those sorts of things. So then what's the argument for donating to more local organizations where it seems like they aren't having as big a global effect, but they're still really important? How do you argue for donating to them?
So it depends what the local organization is, I think. Certainly if you're a citizen of the United States, which is a country that has a huge influence on the world, I think being politically active is very important. Trying to get the United States to adopt better policies in its, let's say, its climate change policies or a whole range of social policies. Its aid policies could be more effectively directed, I think, and the United States actually gives very little aid very little aid directed at extreme poverty in the world compared to the percentage of its income that it has. So I think it's very good to be politically active and be locally involved in that way. But it is difficult, I think, and this is one of the things that the GiveWell guys decided. When they started GiveWell, they looked at charities broadly, including a lot of charities working within the United States. But they decided that the charities that were working against global poverty were providing much better value per dollar and they dropped a lot of the domestic, they dropped the domestic charities. They're now sort of going back, they've got some more funding and they're putting some people on to look at possibilities in the United States again. But the thing that you're up against here is that although there's certainly poverty in the United States, it's really mostly relative poverty rather than extreme poverty. So it's not really an inability to meet basic needs. People in the United States all have safe drinking water. They can all send their children to school. If they're really seriously ill and they turn up at a hospital emergency room, they can't be turned away. So those basic needs are already being met. And if you think simply about making the best use of your money, let's say a family of 4 in the United States on $20,000 a year is below the poverty line. If you have $1,000 to donate and you give it to them, you've added 5% to their income. It's not making a life-changing difference. If you have a family in Africa that is living on $500 a year and you donate $1,000 to them, as one of the top-rated GiveWell charities called Give Directly does exactly that. It gives one-off cash grants to very poor families. It tells them this is not the beginning of an endless source of money. You are getting one grant. Think about it. Think about how to make a big difference in your lives before you spend it. And of course that can make a life-changing difference, because if you're on $500 a year and you live in a hut with a thatched roof that leaks every time it rains and that you have to work each year at some cost to replace the thatch, you just can never save up enough to buy a tin roof. But now somebody's given you $1,000, twice your annual income, you can buy a tin roof and have hundreds of dollars left over. So, you know, it can make a bigger difference to a family. And that's why it is hard for local causes to compete. And I think, honestly, they don't. I mean, as an active citizen, you can try and get your government to do more for them. But in terms of actually you making the best use of your money, I think the way the world is at the moment, it's going to be elsewhere. Thanks.
There's a line, so I'm going to try to keep it brief. But good night. Good night. So for me, I connected a lot with some of the people that you presented on, mainly Matt. I'm a student at the University of Richmond, and I went to Ghana this summer, and I met this girl who kind of worked in my host family as like a worker, a laborer. And she was 21 and I'm 20, and it was weird because I was coming from the university on this exploration trip to kind of see another part of the world, and she was working from 4 a.m. sweeping and then going to sleep at 10:30 in the night and just working all day. And so for me, I asked her questions and was just trying to understand, how could this be happening? Like, how could our lives be so different when we're about the same age? And I came to find out that she wasn't able to finish high school or do anything, basically. And so in that moment, I just felt like I needed to be a part of the solution. And so I committed like a week before I left to pay for her to go to school. And my host mom had issues, so we had to hide everything from her. And so I'm buying all this stuff in the market and had to like get someone to translate for me because I don't speak the language. And we hid it all up, all in this house that like was a friend of hers. And right now she has started school, which is awesome. And I don't know how it happened. And it's confusing and it's crazy. And I'm getting pictures and I'm so excited. But then at the same time, I don't know what my next step is gonna be because I'm a college student and I don't have an income. And so I'm trying to figure out, how do I fundraise? Because I don't wanna make this commitment to this beautiful girl to say that I'm gonna send you to school for 3 years and you can graduate, but I don't know how I'm gonna pay for that. So we're talking about these large charities and they're awesome, but it's like, as one person that's trying to fundraise for one person to go to school and just make a difference in one life, how do I go about that? I think is the biggest question. And how do I get people to be engaged in trying to solve that issue? Because a lot of people want to hashtag educating girls and hashtag all this stuff, but then when you ask, okay, I have this real girl and she is really trying to go to school and I am really trying to invest in her, and can you help me? It's not the same response because it's not sexy.
Well,
It's not.
I think the way you've told that story actually is very impressive. And I think it's wonderful that you're doing that, and you've been able to go there, and you can realize that essentially the difference between you and this girl you're helping is that you were fortunate to be born in the United States, and she was less fortunate to be born in Ghana, which, you know, is by no means the worst of the developing countries, of course. In Africa, it has pretty good governance, and in some ways it does fairly well, but that's still the situation, that I think something like a quarter of the population is really poor in Ghana. So, you know, I think it seems to me like you're a great ambassador for Ghana, and maybe there are even people in this room, or certainly other people who would like to help you in helping not only this one girl, but in helping some of her friends to go to school as well, and you can build up connections. And I know people who've done that. Part of the problem is, I guess, you're not a 501c3, so people are not going to get tax deductions for giving to you. Some people, if you're online, may not even be entirely trusting, because we all know that there's scams online. So there are those questions that need to be raised, and you may eventually need to deal with, and you may want to find a charity register that you can work through. But I think it's terrific when people have those personal connections and talk to other people about them, because it is a way of not only helping specific people, but also raising awareness about the situation. So I certainly welcome what you're doing, and I hope that other people, perhaps here at Richmond, will be interested in supporting you in helping that girl and others as well. Thank you. Yeah.
Hey, Dr. Singer, good evening, and thanks for your time. I was curious in listening to your description of the effective altruism movement. How do you see it fitting or not fitting with the ethics of some of the world's great religious traditions? And if there is a fit, do you see a way that those traditions may help foster the movement?
Yes, I think it fits very well with many of the world's great religious traditions, in fact. I mean, clearly it fits with Christian traditions, that you know, if you read the words of Jesus as reported in the Gospels, it seems to me pretty clear that the central message is about poverty and about helping the poor. And I welcome the fact that Pope Francis is trying to get the Catholic Church back to that issue. I mean, you know, you don't find a lot in the Gospels about abortion or homosexuality or those kinds of issues, but you do find a lot about helping the poor. So I think that fits very well with the Christian tradition. The Jewish tradition also suggests tithing to help the poor. The Islamic tradition has this tradition of zakat, which suggests that you give a portion of your wealth each year to help the poor. I know that there are Buddhist organizations. There's an organization called Tzu Chi, which started off in Taiwan, started off by a Buddhist nun, and has grown to spread around the world, that is helping people in need. So there are many religious traditions that I think along these lines. And although, you know, my ethics comes out of a secular background, I think it's very much in harmony with the great religious traditions of the world. And I don't think that's an accident. I think that it's you know, reflective thinkers, whether they're religious leaders or secular ethics, can see that when we're well off, it's a good thing to do to help people who are much less well off than we are.
Dr. Singer, good evening, and thank you so much for being with us tonight. My question is concerning the extent to which we had to do good. You already partly answered already, but let me be more specific about that, because you're asking us to do the most possible good, not only the good, which implies to do a cost-benefit analysis that we could lead to understand that some people that we don't see and are very far away from us need more of our help than the people that we see and are close to us. So the problem I see here is a problem about humanity itself. You are stressing the importance of being rational and doing a rational choice, and you're stressing the importance of using our heads. But humans are also people that have hearts, and that may find this choice impossible, and maybe find it impossible to benefit people that they don't see more than the people that surround them and they love them. How is it possible? How is it human? slightly philosophical, but I guess you're used to those.
Yeah, well, it clearly is possible because some humans do it. Some humans do it more than others, but it's clearly possible. But I agree, you know, the kind of intuitive thing, if you like, the thing that we've evolved to respond to normally is to help people in a face-to-face society. Because, you know, for most of our evolutionary history, that's all we could do. We couldn't help people who are far away. We now live in a different world, and I think we have to try to develop emotional responses to that. Perhaps the internet is going to help us. Perhaps it's going to help us connect with people. You know, Mark Zuckerberg wants everybody in the world to be on Facebook, and you know, that's not a bad idea in a way if we can connect with people and learn more about them. Some people, like the woman who spoke before, are able to go to the developing world countries, but others may not, but they may still feel connected to people, and then they may be able to get that emotional response that you mentioned. Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Singer. That was a really dense and rich presentation. I enjoyed it. Thank you. One question I did have, though, is that when you spoke about the founders of the GiveWell Foundation, they seem like really knowledgeable guys, really smart guys, and they put a lot of work into what their website and organization came to be. And there's a ton of information on the charities they research so that people can put money into individual foundations like more effectively. But the question that was raised for me was, what data are they making available so that these sort of so that what the better foundations are doing would be replicable? And if they're not doing that, have you seen any websites or foundations going in that direction where they're researching and making these sort of things replicable on like an individual basis so that more people can engage, so that way they're not compartmentalizing the problem by simply giving away their money? Because I noticed that was something you talked about a lot, but I'd imagine like it would be more effective to have a ton of people mobilized around the issue instead of just trying to put their money in the best places.
Sure, yeah, thanks for that. That's a good point. I didn't only want to talk about donating money. I do think putting time into causes, as I said, being an active citizen, educating people about opportunities is certainly important. So yes, I think GiveWell are very transparent in terms of what they do and how they do it. And if you spend time on their website, you can find out a lot of that. And they're not the only one who is involved in studies of what programs work. They're probably the premier one in terms of actually evaluating specific charities. But in terms of evaluating things like, I mentioned the cash grants that Give Directly does. In terms of evaluating, does that work? How does that compare with giving people a cow, for example, as another charity does? Or what other things work well? How well do malaria nets work? What about safe drinking water, giving dispensers that provide safe drinking water? How does that work? How about training people in starting small businesses? There's a whole lot of different things. And there are other organizations that are investigating that. There's one called Innovations for Poverty Action, started by a Yale professor of economics called Dean Carlin. You can find that online. There's the Poverty Action Lab, started by Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee at MIT. They're doing that kind of research. So there's more happening in this area now. And there are opportunities, if you want to get into that area yourself, there are opportunities to go and study and learn how to do that research and actually do it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Singer. Thank you so much for coming tonight. You co-edited my bioethics textbook, so this is such an honor.
Oh, great.
But my name's Tori, and I was wondering, one issue that I have with this kind of like cost-benefit analysis of philanthropic work is that I feel like as Americans we're very fixated on numbers and quantifiable results of charities when we see more real systematic change from investing in communities and relationships and slower change and progress. I worked for a nonprofit organization that operates in Uganda, Iraq, Somalia, India, and Mongolia over the summer, and I would say that our organization, the quantifiable results would be less, but the relationships we're building and the foundation that we're laying for lasting change, I think that that's hard to quantify. So how can we determine what's worth investing in when really a lot of these numerically based projects can be kind of Band-Aid fixes on poverty?
Yeah, it's true that effective altruists and sites like GiveWell in particular tend to look at things you can quantify, because that's how you can have a high degree of confidence. But effective altruism in itself, as I said, it looks at expected value. So if you think you could have a big benefit, you could do something that maybe only has a small chance of success, but if it's successful, it will help millions of people, that could well be worth doing. What you need to do, I think, is to have some strategy that shows how there is a chance that this will succeed and how substantial the benefit is if it does succeed. That's really what you need to look at. And then perhaps you want to compare similar things. So you can learn from experience to see what works or what doesn't work. But I acknowledge that it's in some cases it's going to be a gamble. It's going to be a speculative gamble, and you may have to go with your hunch on that kind of activity. And I'm not saying that you should never do that. I'm just saying you should sit down and think about whether the hunch has some basis, some chance of pulling off a big success. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've got one more question, I'm being told. So, gentleman there is, I'm sorry, well, I'm not the gatekeeper, but the dean there is the gatekeeper, so.
Honestly, save the best for last anyway.
Keep close to the microphone, please.
So this is not exactly like related to like helping the world. This is more of kind of something that I would ask like I should stop using like so much. This is a way to what I would ask, kind of one of those things that would start a debate on ethics. So say someone has terminal cancer and they're probably going to be dead in a few months, and it might be, what if it's best to put like a morphine injection on them so that they would just die without suffering, instead of having to suffer and then they'll probably die a few months later? Because you say that you want to alleviate suffering, but you also want to save lives. So just wondering.
Well, if they're requesting the assistance in ending their life, I think that ought to be permissible. That's pretty close to what a number of states in the US now permit. Oregon, Washington, Montana, Vermont, and now California will permit once the regulations are in place. That is, they would allow the physician to write a prescription for a lethal drug that the patient could then drink. They don't allow an injection. There are some countries, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, that do allow that. And I support actually both methods. I don't think there's a really significant moral difference between them. So I think people ought to have that choice if they've decided that they've had enough, and as you say, if they're terminally or perhaps incurably ill. But yeah, that is a different topic from what we're on. Do I have to stop now? I've got some people very keen to ask a question, I can see, but I'll go along with whatever you say.
Excuse me, sir. One guy...
I'm sorry, I think we don't have time for a second question.
You are. All right, we'll let one more.
All right, we'll let this.
So I think one guy handed me this slip. I personally think this is a no. Ask him about killing, in his view on killing infants who are already born.
Well, I mean, I don't mind talking about that if people want to. It's really nothing to do with what I'm talking about now. I've written about that. Let me just say this briefly. Hospitals in every major city in this country are taking decisions to end the lives of severely disabled infants. They're doing that by withdrawing respirators on, for example, very premature infants that they know cannot breathe without a respirator. I think that's a difficult decision to make, but I think sometimes it's a justifiable decision with the consent of the parents. I don't see a big moral difference between ending an infant's life by turning off a respirator when you know that the infant will not be able to breathe without a respirator, and ending an infant's life by some more direct method. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. I do realize that there are more questions that, and conversations that you may want to have, and so I'd like to invite you to join us in the Jepson Alumni Center, where we can continue the conversations, where we'll have a reception, and Peter Singer's book, The Most Good You Can Do, will be available there for signing and for purchase. Please also mark your calendars for the next event in the Jepson Leadership Forum on January 28th, when James Hamblin, who is the writer and senior editor at The Atlantic, he's host of the video series, If Our Bodies Could Talk, and he'll give a lecture on scientific storytelling, deconstructing the media's critical role in public health. Before we adjourn then to the Jepson Alumni Center, so not here, but in the usual place where we have receptions for the Leadership Forum, we'll be in the pavilion, so there'll be plenty of room for receiving things to drink and eat and conversation. Before we adjourn there, please join me once more in thanking Peter Singer for a wonderful talk.